Hard to imagine that just 5 years ago, nearly the entire world was shut down because of COVID-19. No schools, no socializing, masks, masks, masks. Was it really all necessary?
Let's start from the beginning.
It's been a little over 5 years since the initial COVID lockdowns, and while many are looking to put the pandemic behind them, some health experts are looking ahead to the next pandemic.
What is likely to happen, I don't know if it's going to be next year or 10 years or 15 or 20 years from now, is the emergence of another respiratory disease. It may be another coronavirus, because we know that coronaviruses really, mostly in bats, have the capability of binding to receptors that are in humans. It could be another flu.
Dr. Anthony Fauci, of course, speaking at the New Orleans Book Festival late last month, said he's concerned over the spread of illnesses like bird flu and the cuts being made to the dozens of agencies and offices under the purview of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in the Department of Health and Human Services.
We're dealing with H5N1 now, which is bird flu, which has taken the somewhat disturbing step of infecting mammals, namely cows and cats and other mammals, which means it's adapting itself more to a human. So my concern, Walter, is that whenever that happens, the next outbreak will be of a respiratory disease that's easily transmissible, that has a significant degree of morbidity.
And we are making this a little bit more dangerous with the cuts and our attitude toward science?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're removing the pandemic preparedness and response programs that we put in place, 5 or 6 years ago.
Fauci has received a lot of his criticism over his role in the coronavirus response, especially lockdowns. He's been accused of working to censor dissenting voices during the height of the pandemic. And my major criticism, Niall, that I'm going to get into here is we have to be prepared for the next pandemic. How about this? How about we don't cause the next pandemic by doing the exact kind of research he is discussing and has been the chief proponent of doing, including during the Obama administration, when Obama ordered a halt to such research. It is not a conspiracy theory. It is the opinion of the FBI, the Energy Department, and the CIA independently, for various reasons that I wish we could see publicly and know more of, that the most plausible origins for COVID is a lab experiment gone wrong in China, doing research with members of a research team that Fauci's people were funding and interacting with. And so that's why I don't want to hear from them, we're doing too much cuts. It's our distrust of science is what's going to cause another pandemic. The distrust of science is the scientists causing the pandemic in the first place.
Logical.
So I think that is healthy and appropriate skepticism, and a lot of this needs to be reviewed and totally shut down so that we don't have another situation where we kill millions and millions and millions of people because they did experiments on bats in unsafe conditions.
Would you shut down, to be clear, all form of gain-of-function research?
I would do like Barack Obama, I would call for a total shutdown of all gain-of-function research. And then this is what Rand Paul supports. I've talked to him about it. He said, shut it down, and then we can come up with a committee that will review if in some very special circumstance, if it should still be done, and then do that. It should not be done in China under conditions we can't manage. Maybe you can do it safely in some Arctic facility somewhere, or in Greenland, the 51st state, whatever. It cannot be done by China under conditions we can't control. Some big news yesterday from my friends at the Washington Free Beacon. How about this? The federal government finally confirmed 7 U.S. military service members contracted a disease with COVID-like symptoms while participating in the Wuhan military games in October of 2019. That's 2 months before the outbreak at the Hunan seafood market, the wet market. Now, this report lends tremendous credence to the lab leak theory of COVID's origins, undercutting the idea of animal spillover from the wet market. It should go without saying, but if people were sick with COVID 2 months before the wet market outbreak, then the wet market is not the originator of the earliest COVID cases. Now, you're probably thinking, Wuhan military games? Huh? What was that?
Would you like me to explain?
Well, in fact, from October 18th through October 27th, 2019, Wuhan, China played host to a kind of Olympic Games for military sports, and many nations, including the U.S., participated. In fact, American participants reported at the time Wuhan seemed like a ghost town. They wondered if, for some reason, the Chinese government had maybe ordered a soft lockdown without international awareness. Wonder what that was about. Now, additionally, 7 U.S. soldiers came down with, as I said, COVID-like symptoms. Now, that doesn't mean they had COVID, of course. COVID can be hard to differentiate from the flu or from having a cold, etc. And they were not tested for COVID since at that time, we're talking about, this is before the pandemic, there are no tests. This all comes, by the way, from a Biden administration government report that was not made public despite Congress passing a COVID disclosure law that President Biden signed ordering the release of precisely this sort of information. Now it has finally been obtained years later by the Washington Free Beacon. The report notes that the Wuhan military games were held in close proximity to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where scientists were engaged in dangerous research on bats, and that research was funded by you, the U.S. taxpayers, with the full backing of Dr. Anthony Fauci. Richard Ebright is a scientist who favors the lab leak explanation for COVID's origin, saying it's very likely. He tells the Free Beacon it's an outrage that the Biden White House and the 118th Congress, Senate, and House Armed Services Committee did not publicly release this information when it became available in 2022, but instead withheld this information for the duration of their terms. Now, this should be taken as yet one more piece of evidence that when the mainstream media, expert scientists, and some Democratic politicians demonize the lab leak theory as a racist conspiracy theory, remember that? They were the ones promoting misinformation. The Energy Department, the FBI, the CIA, they all believe lab leak is the most likely cause of the pandemic. I don't know about you, but by now, I am outraged that information about COVID's potential origins is still being withheld from the American public and has been for years. Why was this report kept secret by the Biden administration? Why has the federal government not told us more about suspicions that bat scientists at the Wuhan lab were sick with COVID before the wet market outbreak took place? The Wall Street Journal has reported that. We would like to hear more about it. Who is being protected by all of this? Is it just knee-jerk secrecy? The American people deserve answers. Their elected representatives passed legislation to give them those answers. Biden agreed to provide those answers. Now Trump is president, so no excuses. The federal government needs to tell us everything, and I mean everything that is known about COVID's origins. With the potential for another pandemic, due perhaps to reckless research, the fate of the world may very well depend on these disclosures. So we have more information here, Marianne, coming from the government. There's a government report that was not released to the public, despite the clearest possible law being passed and signed by Biden saying we will disclose knowledge of COVID origins. We want to know. I want to know what was the cause of this horrific mass killing event that ruined the country, ruined the world for several years. Now we know that scientists participated in these military games at Wuhan,
Right.
and it's not service members, and they were sick.
Right.
Maybe it wasn't COVID. We don't know for sure.
Right.
We also have heard reporting from the Wall Street Journal, reported very credibly, that scientists, the very scientists who worked on the bats, got sick with disease at about the same time. So that's all very highly suspicious, and we need to know more about it, because if it is the case that people had COVID before the wet market outbreak, then the wet market outbreak was just a super spreader event like a party at a mall or whatever, or a movie theater. It was not the cause of COVID if people already had COVID before that happened.
Well, on this one, I agree with you. And I never bought the wet market. It didn't feel right to me. It always felt to me. I think lab leak feels more correct, but I think there are bigger issues here as well. First of all, anyone that doesn't, and this has been going on for a while, but particularly around health issues, anyone who doesn't fit the official narrative about health in this country is called a conspiracy theorist.
You know this
and that
from personal
I
experience.
do know it, and that is the way to. First of all, it's the way to actually foster genuine conspiracy theories, because when people get to the point that they know, I think there's something we're not being told here, then they stop believing anything officialdom has to say. And it's very important that on some things, including health, that we do get the straight up information. So I agree with you on this one. And I think that there are secrets. You know, they say in AA that you're as sick as your secrets. And I think that's true of a country as well. I always felt that way about like the assassination of JFK, that the fact that we never, there's something when a secret is in the air and nobody knows the truth. That's why justice is so important, that truth is ultimately determined. And I think when it comes to COVID, this is going to be a kind of toxicity for Americans until this thing gets ultimately handled. So I agree with you on this one, and good for you for keeping the story alive.
I'm Christine Frizzau in Washington. More than 5 years after the deadliest pandemic in a generation, new information that it not only was likely spreading earlier than we were told, but the top officials in the Biden administration knew more than they were letting on.
I want to know who's ass to kick.
The World Military Games in October 2019 brought together 9,000 athletes from 100 countries to the city of Wuhan, China, to compete in an Olympic-style games for service members. As it turned out, many who attended soon became very ill, with symptoms we later learned were very similar to a new virus named COVID-19. Months later, top military officials under President Donald Trump were asked about it.
Was there a special screening for the military team that went to Wuhan, the athletic team? I'm not aware of what you're talking about.
In June of 2021, Republican Congressman Mike Gallagher sent this letter to President Biden's Defense Department, asking for a full investigation into how many U.S. service members became ill and how far the virus may have spread.
Establishing a timeline is critical to understanding where this came from and critical to getting past what I believe to be a systematic cover-up by the Chinese Communist Party.
It turns out an investigation did occur. It led to this report from the DoD, dated December 2022, and provides details of 7 service members who attended the World Military Games and exhibited COVID-19 symptoms in October of 2019. While the report was released to the House and Senate Armed Services Committees at the time, the Biden administration is now being accused of suppressing it.
And the Biden administration just didn't release it to the public.
Congressman Ronnie Jackson is now calling for a new investigation, seeking more answers about the timeline and the origins of COVID-19.
Alarming claims. The Biden administration accused of covering up a congressionally mandated report on the earliest suspected American COVID cases. The Washington Free Beacon says the report reveals 7 Americans may have contracted COVID-19 in Wuhan in October 2019. Free Beacon journalist behind the bombshell report is Andrew Kerr, and he is with us now. This is one of the things that you say, call for number 1 here, that the revelation adds to a mounting body of evidence that the virus was circulating in Wuhan for months before China disclosed it to the world in December of 2019, and further bolsters the growing consensus that it could have leaked into the human population from a Chinese lab. I think a lot of people might be able to understand that. The more interesting thing could be for our audience, who asked for the report and who didn't basically release the report more widely?
Right. So this report showing that we had a military delegation that competed in the World Military Games in Wuhan in October of 2019, and 7 of those members came down with COVID-19-like symptoms, according to this report. Now, it should have been released to the public way back in 2022. Congress required the Biden administration through the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act to do this report into potential COVID links to these military games in Wuhan in October 2019. And the Biden administration just didn't release it to the public. The Trump administration, sometime in late March, quietly released it. And here we are now. So it's bombshell information. It just adds to a growing list of evidence reported by the Wall Street Journals and others that COVID was likely circulating in Wuhan months before the known start of the pandemic in December 2019. And it's just another blow against the initial theory that was propagated by the scientific community that this thing could have leaked into the population through some wet market. But no, now it's just another piece of evidence that it indicates that no, the bat coronavirus research lab, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, that just so happened to be a few miles away from these games where these service members got sick, more likely that is the cause of this virus.
Let me take you in the Wayback Machine to June of 2021. And Josh Rogan did an investigation, and he wrote this. Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby told me that the Defense Department has no knowledge of COVID-19 infection among U.S. troops participating in the 2019 World Military Games. He said that there's no evidence U.S. military personnel were infected before travel restrictions the U.S. government implemented in early 2020. Do you think he didn't know, or was told something that was not true, or what?
That's a great question. What we do know now is that that was not true. Whether he was intentionally misleading the public or if he just didn't know himself, we don't know. But yeah, no, we had 7 service members that contracted COVID-like illnesses. And what's remarkable about this report is that the military did nothing about it. They never tested these service members after the fact for COVID-19 antibodies. They never conducted an investigation into whether there's any sort of link between our guys getting sick over in Wuhan 2 months before the pandemic and the outbreak of the pandemic, and they never even bothered informing our allies. There were military athletes that participated in these games from Italy, Luxembourg, Germany that reported very early on the pandemic that, yeah, we got really sick with COVID-19-like symptoms when we attended those games. And our military knew about these illnesses from our guys, and they didn't even bother informing our allies. It's really quite remarkable.
The Trump administration continues its push to potentially release more classified material. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard announcing this week the administration is considering big changes to the nation's intelligence community and whether to declassify COVID-19 origins material. Gabbard says these decisions will be made by a task force known as the Directors Initiative Group. The panel will not only look into declassifying material on COVID-19, but probes into the mystery health symptom known as Havana syndrome, reported by a number of U.S. diplomats and officials, as well as cost-cutting measures within intelligence agencies. In a statement from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Gabbard said in part, President Trump promised the American people maximum transparency and accountability. We are committed to executing the president's vision. The office did not reveal how the task force will be assembled or when it will submit recommendations to Gabbard. Gabbard also did not disclose which COVID-19 documents are being considered. If declassified, the move would be in line with a recent release of COVID-19 information from the Trump administration.
According to a military report recently declassified by a Trump administration task force, 7 U.S. service members experienced COVID symptoms after participating in the World Military Games. That was in Wuhan, China, in October of 2019. That's 2 months before China disclosed the virus to the world. Joining us now to talk about all of this is the former CDC director, Dr. Robert Redfield. Dr. Redfield, nice to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. What was your first reaction when you first heard about this report?
Well, I think it was obviously real, disappointing it wasn't disclosed. I do think the Wuhan military games were probably one of the first major super spreader events of this pandemic. It's interesting that when those games took place in Wuhan, it was very unusual that the Wuhan government didn't allow any spectators.
Interesting.
So it was like having the Olympics, but they allowed no spectators. So they clearly knew there was something going on in Wuhan at the time. And again, I always thought that the military games were probably one of the early spreading events for the pandemic around the world. It's one of the reasons you saw certain countries like Iran that didn't make a lot of sense, that had some of the very early cases. When you looked at the participation in the games, Iran was a major participant in those games. And so I do think that this was real. I can't comment having been able to see a lot of the classified data in my day, but I'm glad they're finally declassifying this data.
But Dr. Redfield, if this is true, 7 U.S. service members had early symptoms of COVID in 2019. What does that mean for the whole COVID-19 timeline?
Well, I think it was all wrong. This is why I've always been of the point of view that the pandemic came from the Wuhan lab. It didn't come from spillover. And when you read the natural origin paper, it really needs to be retracted because they act as if the epidemic started in December, January. The epidemic really started probably in July August or September timeframe. And again, the games were a big spreading event at the time. So it just reaffirms that the narrative that some people have tried to push that just came from the wet market in December, January is a false narrative.
The CIA previously said that all of the theories on COVID origins, and you know this as well as I do, there were many. It preferred the one that it leaked from a lab in Wuhan, China, like you and I just discussed, but there wasn't enough proof. So now that we have all this new information, do you think there was a cover-up, at least when it comes to China?
Well, I think there was no doubt there was not transparency. There was a cover-up. You could also argue about whether there was a cover-up related to some of the U.S. scientists that were promoting the wet market theory, which was not a credible theory. I always said there were plenty of opinions about the wet market, but there was no scientific evidence. And there was a lot of scientific evidence that this epidemic started from a laboratory in Wuhan, China, from gain-of-function research.
Do you think Dr. Fauci has or ever will come around to the idea that this may have been engineered indeed from a lab?
Well, I think he needs to, and for his own legacy, his own credibility. I mean, he is a scientist. You'll see that the intelligence agencies, the CIA, has changed their analysis. I'm pretty sure that between now and July, all of the intelligence agencies will redefine their analysis, and there'll be unanimity that this virus came from the lab. You saw the National Academy of Science in France just came out almost unanimously and said the origin of this virus was the laboratory in Wuhan. So I think that narrative, which unfortunately the NIH, Fauci was a big part of it, Collins was a big part of it, they created a false narrative. And I think they did that not for their own personal benefit. They did it because they wanted to protect gain-of-function research, and they didn't want the government regulating science. And so that's really why they did this.
Dr. Fauci, the criminal. Those are the latest words coming out of the White House after it overhauled the COVID.gov website this weekend. Now, the site is a lab leak data center displaying what they say is scientific proof that COVID was, in fact, man-made in Wuhan, China. Alleges Dr. Fauci helped cover it up.
The redesign replaces previously offered health information and access to tests and treatment for the contagious disease. Federal agencies have released contrasting reports about the origins of the pandemic. Last December, you may remember, a House investigation found the most likely cause is a lab leak. Other scientists say it's more likely COVID originated in wildlife and was spread to humans at a Wuhan animal market.
The flashy new page has social media users split. Outkick writer Ian Miller says how incredible it is to finally see the truth coming from an official White House website.
Political commentator Brian Krasenstein writes, disgusting. 26,100 Americans have died from COVID-19 in just 3 months under Trump's watch. This is a betrayal of every life we've lost.
Well, I don't know about that. I think it's good to see the administration doing more to get to the bottom of COVID's origins. Now, I would say just redesigning a website, this is kind of a PR thing, and there's too much easy applause, in my view, for practicing sham accountability rather than real transparency. So if the Trump administration is convinced that COVID originated from a lab leak, again, this is the determination that the Energy Department, the CIA, and the FBI have made, that it is more likely it came from a lab than from an animal wet market. I also think it is more likely. I would like to know more. I would like to see more of the raw intelligence that caused the government agencies to reach this conclusion. I don't like just, a web page saying a House report that we already saw. I read the House Republican report on why they think it was a lab leak. There's some interesting stuff in there, to be clear, but I want to get more specific now. It's time to start, and Congress passed a law, and Biden signed it, saying we would have disclosure of everything the government knows about COVID's origins. Despite doing that, we did not get that disclosure. In fact, we had a guest on, Emily Kopp from the Daily Caller News Foundation last week, I believe, to discuss how that intelligence that Biden was supposed to release just didn't get released, relating to the military games that took place in Wuhan, where there were apparently American U.S. service members got sick with COVID-like symptoms. Now, my question, COVID-like symptoms, was that just cough, cold? Well, that could be anything. If it's loss of taste and smell, and this is before, mind you, the animal or the wet market outbreak, well, that would be very indicative of with a wet mark not being the cause of COVID if people were sick with COVID before it happened. So anyway, the government might have more information about that. I want to know. Why don't you put that on the website? Or if the scientists were sick, put that on the website rather than, we all conclude it was lab leak, yay, good job, go home. Hard to imagine that just 5 years ago, nearly the entire world was shut down because of COVID-19. No schools, no socializing, masks, masks, masks. Was it really all necessary? According to our next guest, not quite. In his new book, An Abundance of Caution, author David ZWEIG details how health officials in the U.S., prominent scientists and Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists even, made fundamental mistakes in their assessment of the COVID-related evidence. That led to what he calls the worst American policy failure in a century.
ZWEIG also highlights that as students in Europe returned to school in the spring of 2020, just weeks after COVID was declared a pandemic, kids in most of the U.S. were still locked out of the classroom.
Writer David ZWEIG joins us now. Welcome back to Rising, David, and so nice to see you.
Thanks for having me back.
Yes, great book, hitting on a lot of the themes you've discussed on this show, but including a lot of new research as well. Fascinating insights into what went wrong. Let's just go through, some of the mistakes made by experts that you're correcting here. You point out that the whole flatten the curve methodology that was the basis for so much of the early lockdowns, shutdowns, mandates was based on data that ended up being totally inaccurate. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, it's quite remarkable, and I extensively lay this out in the book, that most of us, or I think probably everyone, remembers the flatten the curve meme, where they show if everyone would just follow the instructions and stay home, then the cases will remain low, but if you don't listen to the instructions, they'll spike and it can overwhelm the hospitals. But what I show in the book is that while that may have been true for a very, very brief window in time, in fact, none of the data actually support the idea that these closures in the society were going to have that type of beneficial effect over the long term. And the one that my book is particularly focused on, of course, is school closures, and how school closures, there was never any evidence that they were going to reduce community case rates over any period of time. And this particularly so when you had all sorts of other things open in society.
And also that the European Union looked at information on the impact of school closures, found that it was not affecting COVID, the spread of COVID, and they actually had policies. We point to, I've my whole life as a right-leaning person, as a libertarian person, I've always been, we should be more like democratic socialist Europe. And then it turns out Europe actually had more open policies on so many COVID topics compared to the U.S., with no comparative, they didn't do worse. In fact, by many measures, they did better than us, despite us, locking down harder and harder, particularly with the schools.
One of the things that's really important I want the American public to understand is that at the end of April and the beginning of May, European countries started reopening many of their schools. And in fact, later in May of 2020, when all the schools were closed in America, millions of children had already been back to school in Europe. And the EU ministers of education met together. And they announced in this meeting in May that opening schools with millions of kids in 22 different countries, and they observed no negative impact of this. They met a second time in June and had the same response. We have not observed any negative consequences of opening schools on community case rates. This news, this wasn't from some obscure blog. This wasn't in a weird academic journal. This is the EU, where they met and announced this, and no one covered it in the United States media, other than me, ultimately, where I reported on it. And in my book, I lay out that in many regards, I think this is the original sin, if you will, of what happened in our response. Most of us, of course, remember that we were told, if they even acknowledged Europe at all, that, well, that's Europe, we need to ignore them, that doesn't count. But yet again, millions of children were in school there. The EU ministers announced that nothing happened, and no one reported on this.
The NOVAVAX COVID-19 vaccine set to finally receive full approval from the FDA. The agency said NOVAVAX must collect more clinical data from people who received that vaccine in order to get full approval. This comes after a delay in the approval process earlier this month. Joining us to talk about this and all of our health topics, it's Dr. Bill Hartman, clinical trialist at UW Health. All right, doctor, this vaccine, it is available right now. What does full approval do?
So full approval means that it can be produced and distributed without any restrictions. Novavax has been operating under its original emergency use authorization, which you'll remember was how all the first vaccines were distributed. But the only ones who have received full approval at this point are the mRNA vaccines from Moderna and Pfizer. And so for the people who want to have a COVID vaccine but don't want to use the mRNA technology, this is a protein-based vaccine. This is very good news for those people.
Yeah, that old school vaccine has kind of been referred to sometimes. You know, many thought politics was in play with this COVID-19 vaccine's delayed approval. This would be good news, right, for those who want the FDA to really be focused in on the science and keep the politics out of this.
Exactly, and we should always keep the politics out of it as much as possible. There was some question with the new administration about single antigen vaccines, but single antigen vaccines like the Novavax vaccine has been used for years. They have a good safety profile. They've got a good efficacy profile. Novavax is no different than those.
A groundbreaking new study sounding alarms about the safety of COVID mRNA vaccines, directly challenging claims from public health officials and raising urgent questions about transparency and trust. So using hard data from disease trends, from patient outcomes and immune system analysis, multiple research reports show that heart inflammation risks tied to the vaccines may be far greater and maybe even more dangerous than previously reported, particularly among young men. Joining us now to discuss this is Independent Medical Alliance Senior Fellow of Pediatric Cardiology, Dr. Kirk Milholm. Good morning to you, doctor. Welcome to the National News Desk. Great to have you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
This new study about the safety of COVID mRNA vaccines was published in the International Journal of Cardiovascular Research and Innovation, as I understand it. Tell us about the scope of this research and really your top findings from it.
So it's a compilation of studies that really have been out there since 2021. We saw a signal in the vaccine product causing problems, especially in the young adults, especially young males, that was causing heart inflammation. And so what we have done is compiled all those different peer-reviewed journals, articles, and data, and put them in one place, easily accessible, with 42 pages and 341 references of our concerns that this is a real issue and these vaccines do little good for healthy children and young adults.
Right. Were you able to distinguish the cause of myocarditis, the differential between a COVID infection versus it being just an adverse reaction to the COVID vaccine?
Yes, it's very clear from a number of reasons that we've been able to evaluate. And primarily, there was a great study out of the Nordic countries that studied 23 million children and young adults, and they found that the people who had the least amount of myocarditis were the unvaccinated. And as you increase the number of vaccine doses, or you use Moderna versus Pfizer, your risk just kept stepping up in terms of your risk for myocarditis. Once again, in a disease state that is really very mild for healthy children and young adults.
You know, initially, this topic was so rare when we first heard about this, myocarditis and the links, to the vaccine. But what does the data reveal now?
So there was a study out of Lancet that showed and looked at all these children who had been harmed by the vaccine and had myocarditis secondary to the vaccine. And they looked at them 90 days out. And a lot of things remained normal, except their cardiac MRI, which showed continued inflammation and possible scarring of the heart itself 90 days out. Further studies, a new study released by Yale said that they're still seeing free-floating spike protein, which is what that vaccine asks the body to make, which is a cardiotoxin still floating around in the body for over 700 days.
Wow.
It was supposed to just be put in and your body made an immune response and then it went away, but it is hanging around in some people.
So it's not transitory. It's not resolving over time. I mean, there's like long-term impacts we're seeing right now.
Yeah, for certain people, it is devastating and long-term issues for a disease process that they had very little risk for.
The FDA was set to release new guidance on COVID booster shots ahead of the fall, but that's now in question. The agency's chief tells CBS News more data is needed on how well the shots work. That uncertainty is now raising questions about updates to other vaccines, too. CBS's medical contributor, Dr. Celine Gounder, is here to explain what's at stake. So, Dr. Gounder, let's start with the FDA commissioner cited a void of data. Now, is that a void of data specific to COVID, or is this a new standard that he's saying, well, we just always need more data now in this new FDA?
Well, there's some of both. But what we're seeing in particular is this request for more data about the updated seasonal COVID boosters. And that's something that we have essentially been copying our approach for flu vaccines we've been doing for COVID vaccines. So instead of doing full clinical trials, the way we did when the COVID vaccines were first approved, we're really just relying on the previous approval for safety and updating based on the newest strains.
So is it possible to do the work that he wants in the time necessary to get this out the door for the next season?
It's basically impossible because you need to be in the middle of a surge to be conducting one of these studies. And so if you're already in the surge with the new variant and you're trying to see if that updated vaccine works, by the time the surge is over, it's too late, right, to be using that vaccine, that updated vaccine.
Right.
So you're really missing the window of opportunity here.
What happens if there's no booster?
Well, it's a good question. We do have the older vaccines, so is it possible that those could be made available from previous seasons? That's one possibility. Another thing that's being talked about is maybe just approving the updated seasonal booster for certain populations. So older people, high-risk people. But if the FDA does not approve it for other groups, even if you want it, you would not be able to get it.
Very quickly, is there a concern this might go to other vaccines and what would be necessary for them to move forward?
Well, it certainly could apply to the flu vaccines because it was that flu vaccine standard we were using to update. But it's also moving the goalpost where it makes the public question, are these vaccines safe? It makes the companies that invest in these question, should we be developing vaccines because you're going to pull the rug out from under us?
And that's the game!
You've disconnected from the hive mind. Explain.